Instead, thanks to crisis, capitalism can sustain longer. Yet, as Garatani commented, to Marx, crisis became important because it would reveal the truth of the capitalist economy that is invisible in the everyday economy. So the GFC, if it is not the evidence that capitalism is in crisis, does it tell capitalism itself is the crisis by revealing some kind of truth? The answer will still be political. Here I introduce two novelistic methods of revealing the truth, or what's been invisible in everyday economy in the capitalist system, thereby politically interpreting financialization and crisis, and in a broader sense, capitalism itself. The first method is offering the temporal parallax view, taken by the American novel, The Financial Lives of the Poets by Jess Walter. And second is spatial parallax view, taken by the British novel titled Capital by John Lanchester. Both novels take the 2007 subprime crisis as their backgrounds. So here I'm using the concept of parallax, astronomical concept that I borrow from Karatani, of course, astronomy. And in astronomy, the parallax angle means it's something that gives you the tool to calculate the distance to stars. So there's a stars here, and if the parallax angle is big, the star is close. And the parallax angle is smaller, that means the star is distant. So it gives you the distance to the stars, the parallax angle. So let's say this star is financialized contemporary capitalism here. So if you view from here, before crisis, in the case of the first, the novel, then you view the star before crisis and after crisis. So there's a time difference. And you view the star by Londoners' eyes and non-Londoners' eyes, then these stars will be viewed and observed different because the backdrop will changes. So this is concept I'm borrowing to explain how the crisis system is viewed differently before crisis and after crisis, and by Londoners' eyes and by non-Londoners' eyes. So the first novel illustrates a week-long crisis of financial life of the protagonist until foreclosure and bankruptcy. This novel is written in an ex post facto manner, which means the protagonist recalls, reinterprets, and post factum assesses his own financial life after the crisis ends, in whatever that ends means. After foreclosure and bankruptcy, he reapproaches his own past performance as financial subject or investor subject with highly critical and self-satirical eyes. Schematically speaking, creation of financial subjectivity is about leading the life based on two non-complementary formulae here. The first is money, commodity, money prime, which originally belongs to the capitalist classes, which is buying variable and constant capital with money secured through primitive accumulation and produce some products, either real goods or financial products, and sell them in the markets as commodities. And the other belongs to the non-capitalist classes, which is commodity, money, commodity prime, which means selling labor to earn money to buy a house and reproduce yourself. So financial subject crisis in this first novel is caused by the clash between the two formulae. They take money, commodity, money prime as their grammar of living, like this, but they are actually living under this formula, commodity, money, commodity prime. So they must sell, in order to make more money through house as commodity, they must sell their labor power and credibility to get the money to buy a house in the first place. But selling labor power becomes increasingly difficult historically, which is peculiarly post-millennial phenomenon. And if you don't have a job, you can't get the loan. So they collapse while failing to liquidate their commodities, which means not being able to convert things like house or labor into commodity and to make cash out of it. So the cash flow goes bad and means going bankrupt. So the process goes like this. And then home goes, you can't produce yourself, and the money goes, the potential money goes. One of critical comment of this novel is inverting the meaning of recovery and relapse. in mainstream economy, the bottom out from the crisis means economic recovery. The capitalist future promised by economic revitalization justifies the theory of up and continuation of capitalist growth, while forgetting and normalizing crisis. The novel post factum defines recovery as relapse into addiction to up after the protagonist's experiences of immiseration and wageless and houseless life. This redefinition politically criticized the so far socially chanted, seemingly salutary performance of financial subjectivity and once justified aspiration toward unremitting growth, especially promised by the contemporary financial capitalism, marked by automated valorization of money. So after the crisis ends as bankruptcy, and after the experience of contradictory financial life as investor subject, the protagonist at last becomes able to have temporal parallax view toward how the American society is financially formed and lived, so that he can now specify recovery as relapse, politically dissenting the financialized capitalism in which any recovery becomes a prelude to another crisis. The second novel is Capital by British novelist John Lanchester. The novel presents many characters from various national backgrounds, classified into two groups. The first group is the British, who are going through a crisis caused by every aspect of society's financialization and neoliberalization, like living as financial subjects, disintegrated community, and declining social welfare and medical system. The other is the non-British immigrants. Lanchester calls them external proletariats in somewhere else, or what I call inner outsiders, people of the boundary. Here I focus on this second group of people who come from the periphery, physically different side of the globe. Therefore, they are able to look at the British and their financial minds and their crisis in completely different territorial and cultural contexts. The spatial background of the novel is one fictional road in London that saw a dramatic increase in asset value. On top of this linear event of financialization history of one road in London, Lanchester deploys not only multiple societal aspects that cause crisis to the British, but also multidimensional spatial layers by bringing eyes from somewhere else. So they are neither complete insiders nor complete outsiders. In the novel, they are sort of an anonymous camera lens that critically look at the British, and a refugee's vigilant eyes that execute the parking regulations, or the eyes that goes to the far at London Eye, so and have panoramic vision about of London. So such spatial position situate them in the interstices as critical topos, I argue, and these inner outsiders have distancing eyes, standing obliquely away from the closed discursive circuit. Yet I must note that the writer does not give them any transcendent status. They are not omnipresent. They are not objective third eyes. They also experience their own kind of crisis caused by collision between their own cultural backdrops and capitalist development as a world system. Lanchester once said that Marx was not an empiricist, but he is, and said, "I don't think it's possible to have a vantage point free of ideological pressures, so you have a duty to do the best with what you can see." Saving the argument about his interpretation of Marx, just as Marx stood at interstices between Germany and England, Lanchester invites those transpositional inner outsiders with multiple spatial parallax views. In fact, Lanchester himself is a sort of inner outsider who has spent his life in Hong Kong until the mid-20s. Probably for this reason, he seems to be conscious and cautious about his own limitations of what he can see. And this would be why he deploys this suspicious eyes, sometimes critical, sometimes not even being able to comprehend what's in the British mind, British financial mind, and sometimes incomprehensive to readers, depending on where those readers come from. These two novels, I'm almost done, yes. These two novels are realism novels, and in the present day, the genre is being harshly criticized for not being able to represent fictitious capital and not being able to present any coherent alternatives or protest. unlike traditional novelistic realisms. But I want to say the genre could be suitable for understanding the way in which our everyday life is financialized and why and how it can be itself the crisis. And in the era of unimaginability outside capitalism, instead of presenting some simple alternatives, such cautious offering of spatial temporal parallax views might be more serious dissent that recognizes the capital's naturalization power. Thank you for listening.
Of perceptions of place in contemporary Ireland using analog visual technologies. So Katrina Maguire was born in Derry, Northern Ireland, and graduated from the National College of Art and Design, Dublin, with an MA in Fine Art, Media, and attained her primary degree in painting from the Chelsea School of Art in London. Maguire is based in County Limerick and is currently a PhD candidate of film and visual studies at the School of Arts of English and Languages at Queen's University Belfast, and is also a lecturer in fine art painting at Limerick School of Art and Design. So I'm very pleased to introduce Katrina and look forward to seeing her practice-based project. So Katrina, when you're ready, you're ready to feel free to begin. Yes, Katrina, sorry, I think your microphone is still, well, I don't know if you did mute it, but it's still muted. So if you are saying anything to us, I'm afraid that we can't hear it at the moment. But we can see your presentation.
Oh, can you? You can see it. Great.
There we go. You're all coming through great now, so we can.
Yeah, is that great? You can see it? Brilliant.
Yeah, you can see it, hear it. Great.
Yeah. That's lovely. Thanks for the introduction, and sorry for the apologies for delaying the conference with the technical hitch earlier. So I'll begin now. So you can see everything okay? Yeah?
Yeah, everything's great.
Great, yeah. Brilliant. So I'm just going to start here now, and my project, the thesis title is Reimagining Ruins, a practice-based study of perceptions of place in contemporary Ireland using analog visual technologies. I'm studying at Queen's University Belfast, and my supervisors are Dr. Des Raw and Richard O'Sullivan. This practice-based doctoral research project contributes to a new understanding of Ireland's contemporary ruin by responding to the abandoned building sites derived from the collapse of Ireland's Celtic Tiger economy in the late 2000s. Through an artistic practice encompassing photography and film, the project explores how art and creative practice can respond to this condition, offering new perspectives on how we engage with temporality and ruination, memory and place. At the height of Ireland's economic crash, the construction of hundreds of housing estates together with a significant number of commercial complexes became discarded and were left to disintegrate, leaving an imprint on the landscape and the social psychology of Irish citizens. These abandoned domestic and commercial developments have become new ruins in a country synonymous with various forms of architectural, agricultural, and political ruination caused by its colonial history, famine, and mass emigration. The project will demonstrate how these incomplete sites signify a new model in contrast to Ireland's traditional ruin, epitomizing a time that has long passed, a lived history, and beholding fragmented forms that sit comfortably in the landscape, whereas the contemporary ruin is not fully formed or inhabited, attains an absence and a presence representing both the past and an abandoned future. In Place, an exhibition book by Tacita Dean and Jeremy Miller, Dean explains place connecting with time, for place will always connect to somewhere in our autobiographies, future and past. As an artist, I have always explored place in my work, memory as place, and also reimagining place. So it's been an important subject area within my work. So, and just in reference to the sort of the personal life and the connection to place within my art projects, I actually was resident in Dublin, but moved to Limerick, small city in Ireland, in 2007. And I lived in a small village outside the city, and was living in a small housing estate, which became a ghost estate with the crash of the Celtic Tiger. So during this time, I was like making some photographs, drawings, and paintings of this site. And I was, you know, the work was going fine, but I started thinking about how I could challenge the work. And so when I started the PhD research, I decided to work with analog technologies. And I will explain this further as we go along, but I had worked with digital video before as well in my practice. So my tools of the trade became Polaroid photography and Super 8 film. So what I'm going to present here in the in this presentation is the exhibition that I showed in January, entitled Static Vision, which is part of the practice. And here, there's a Polaroid here with graffiti, Static Vision, Faith in the Future. And sometimes when you're naming an exhibition, it can be quite difficult. But in this case, this was like a gift, because I was visiting the site and seeing this graffiti. And the Static Vision is actually the name of a Limerick band, and Faith in the Future is one of their EPs. So the gift of the title of the show was given to me, which was great. So Static Vision explores how the visual arts can interpret this recent phenomenon through working with film and analog technologies, demonstrating how the increasing obsolescence of these media draw parallels to the condition of Ireland's contemporary ruins, signifying a past time and period of progress and modernity, but now discarded and redundant. In recent years, there has been much debate on the virtues of analog and digital formats in light of film's demise by contemporary artists and filmmakers, including Tacita Dean, Ben Rivers, and Stan Douglas. These discussions inform the project's exploration on the dichotomies between media and its representation, and a dialogue between time and place. The project explores the correlation between photography and film's ephemeral celluloid fabric, and the decay and stains of time displayed on the unfinished structures of the contemporary ruin, each a temporal barometer, physically registering memory, the imprint and history of time. So here is the entrance to the exhibition, and there's 5 works in the show, but I don't see them as separate works. They're very much components of each other. So I'm going to sort of, you know, describe these works and the connections between them in relation to the research. So Static Vision, January 2020, the gallery exhibition acted as a catalyst for the creative and conceptual aspects of this practice-based project, and invited the viewer to actively participate in its temporal and material qualities of the images, offering simultaneous engagements with stillness and movement, ruination and reclamation. So the first work we're going to look at is Ruin Reclamation. And this is expired Fujifilm Instant Color FP100C film negatives presented on a light box. So when you think of Polaroid, we normally think of the classic frame Polaroid, but in this instance, I actually was able to access the expired Fujifilm, and this is a peel apart film. So when you would like take your photograph, and then as you waited for it to develop, you peeled the photograph away from its negative. So I actually then started to reclaim the negatives. So I was documenting the ghost estate where I live, and I would then return to the house, and in my kitchen, I would reclaim the negative with household bleach. So you can see here in the slide that these still photographs, or negatives rather, they were made, a light box was made for the actual space of the gallery, and they ran along 3 walls, and it was like a cinematographic film street. So suddenly it became, like a film piece as much as a still photography piece. So the viewer would become they would move along to experience the piece. And here we can see the camera up against these would have been walls for some of the houses, the vintage camera. Polaroid photography is employed for its distinct indexical, temporal, material, and visual qualities, and to facilitate an intuitive interaction with these abandoned sites. This creative practice encourages a dialogue between the activity of looking and recording and that of delivering on-site single-framed images and objects, a dialogue that can also probe the dichotomies between the past and present, the fixed single moment and the sequential fixed moment. So across from ruin reclamation, a film installation was installed, and 2 works, Super 8 film works, temporal motion, and still to moving instance. Recordings were made in Super 8 to examine celluloid's ephemeral and temporal qualities and investigate the medium's transformative capacity through engaging with its alchemical processes and presentational properties. The research examines how this low-gauge medium and its capacity to interpret time, duration, and movement can also communicate statics. And Super 8's textural qualities and static shots are also analysed within this context to emulate the abandoned sites in between conditions, stuck in time, yet slowly evolving and changing. The work was informed by other artists working with Super 8, primarily and most famously is Derek Jarman and his work, and also Vivian, the Irish artist Vivian Dick, and her Super 8 films, particularly Staten Island. So here's the installation here, the 2 film pieces, and the films were screened using Super 8 projectors. And what was interesting within the space was that the whirring sound of the movement of the film going through the projectors and being illuminated, this sound, you could hear the sound throughout the gallery. So it accompanied the still sequences, and they were, so that was resonating around the space, which was quite beautiful. So here in the film, and also in another series of Polaroids, which we'll see after, there is a protagonist, which I call the model, who is like the witness and within the work, and she's there or he is like an anonymous hooded figure, and they play out and engage with the ruin. So the Rooken figure from behind has been a device that has been used in paintings, most famously by Caspar David Friedrich. The work was informed by Belltar's opening sequence of Damnation, where the protagonist is sitting at a window and you see the back of the protagonist. Also, John Agnefi's The Nine Muses has used the Rooken figure as well in his films. So temporal motion, had the sequences were off the ruin site, the commercial ruin site, were interspersed with some sequences of myself editing the film and the film being moved through the editing machine. So that they were interspersed with these static images and then this moving imagery of the actual film. So this was quite informed by Levda Slavova, apologies for my pronunciation, of Vartov's Man with the Moving Camera, where she is seen editing and cutting the film and handling the film. Still to moving instance, here in this work, there is a Polaroid photograph, and it is up against the ruin site, the commercial ruin site, and in this, the commercial ruin site is actually being demolished. So it was interesting, the project, to see the ruin from it being stuck in time to actually then disappeared. It has actually now disappeared now. So this is almost like an archive image. So there's a dichotomy between the moving and the still. This was very informed by Hollis Frampton's piece Nostalgia, where again, exploring the movement and the transformation of the photograph from being a still to disappearing and being burnt. Working with analog technologies challenges the medium's specificity and offers a new approach to merging, reinterpreting, and experiencing desperate forms of ruination. Static Vision 2019-20 is a projector here, the Super 8 film, and this was like a bridge between the installation piece and the next piece, Ruin Instance. And here we have the lovely ribbon of the Super 8 film, but only one frame being projected into the projector, which has a little box, so it's sort of reminiscent of a movie theater or a cinema. And the scale of this is quite interesting because it was actually the size of a Polaroid. So in the space, there's these beautiful mirrors within the space that reflect of different parts of the exhibition, which was very nice. When you would be maybe looking at one piece, you could see the reflection of another as you navigate it, and as the pieces unfolded within the gallery. So here we have Ruin Instance, which is made up of two sequences, both with 126 Polaroid photographs, black and white. And this was very informed by Chris Marker's La Jetty, the film made up of still black and white images, the photo Roman. So this really informed the making of Ruin Instance. And here you can see the protagonist, the model acts out within the work, and in some ways I was almost making a film through making these Polaroid sequences, and I would return from the site and then I would actually make shot lists. So I started dealing with film language, looking at mid shots, close-up shots, a distance shot, establishing shots. And here, this would have been also very informed by Wim Wenders' film Alice in the City, where they utilized the first prototype of the SX70 Polaroid camera. And the protagonist here is looking at a sequence of Polaroids. Also, Wim Wenders' exhibition of Polaroids in London a couple of years ago has informed. I was able to see that exhibition. Robbie Muller's Polaroids, and of course, Andrei Tarkovsky's Polaroids. I've been very interested in how these filmmakers were they were quite fascinated with the medium of Polaroid. And of course, Stalker and Nostalgia by Tarkovsky has also informed the project. So here's just some more images of the Polaroids and their sequences. Barbara Proud's.
Just to say 2 minutes, Katrina.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. So Barbara Proud's exposure is a contemporary artist, and the actual way she uses film language as well within her work, stills, but it's almost, they're like moving sequences, but they're still images. Here's some more installation views of the show. And to accompany the exhibition, I made a publication as an extension to the artwork. And this features the series of the Polaroids. And it's quite an intimate little publication that the viewer could take away with them. So it's a work within itself. And a lot of artists are making artist books as sort of part of their practice. This is very informed by Ed Ruscha's books, 26 gasoline stations, every building on Sunset Strip. As part of the exhibition, I also had a number of talks in the gallery, but the main discussion was with a colleague from the Art College, Limerick School of Art and Design, Dr. Dara Waldron, and the audience was, the public from Limerick City, visitors to the city, and also artists and students from the Art College. And lastly, as part of the project, a former student of mine at their college, Justin Goff, did an interview with me, and that's available on YouTube. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That was very interesting. Brilliant, and a nice balance between theory, textual criticism, and visual and practice-based projects. So I suppose we're running quite a bit over time, but we've still got the Q&A lined up ahead. So I don't know if, well, we'll see if anybody has any questions for our presenters. So if you'd like to either raise your hand in the chat or type your questions out in entirety and who they're directed to. So it seems that firstly we've got Erin has got a question for a panelist. So Erin, go right ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists. This was a really fascinating set of presentations, and I think they speak really well to each other. So I have 100 questions that I could ask you all. But to begin, I'd like to direct something to Jay, if that's okay. And I'm about to ask maybe quite a broad question. My work is mostly around like lyric theory and what it is to be a textual subject. And something that came up a little during your presentation was the idea of financial subject. So I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to what this idea kind of gestures to for you. Oh, you're on mute. Oh. Ah, there you go.
Yeah, can you repeat that question? It was like
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on the idea of the financial subject that came up during your presentation.
Oh, yes, for financial subjectivity, like investor subject and stuff. Yeah, as I explained on I try to explain as much as I can in the PowerPoint slide, but financial subjectivity is like basically the finance is in your mind. So when you think about the house, you think as an investment tool. And if you think about the education, you invest your education to earn money out of it. So it's basically I put the money, what I have, and buy commodities and make more money out of those commodities. So that's basically capitalist classes mindset originally, because they put money and make commodities and make more money out of it. But we are disciplined to think like that, even though we are under the commodity prime situation, which is by selling labor power, earn money, and reproduce ourselves. That's not the capitalist mindset. There's only the labor power sellers mindset, which also again shows the kind of like how the powerful the capital is, because the labor power seller think within that formula, and capitalist classes think within that formula. But financial subjectivity is kind of like two formula is mixed in the brain and doesn't work properly, and that leads to the crisis, and that leads to the foreclosure and bankruptcy of one, of protagonist life in the novel and in our ordinary life. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
Great. Okay. I can also see we've got a question from Nina from Daryl here. So Daryl, yeah, go on ahead.
Hey, thanks to all of the presenters for some extremely interesting talks. First of all, my question is for Nina. I was thinking a bit about the role of Carver's editor, Gordon Lish, about whether or not Lish is functioning as a kind of landlord for Carver in the textual space. You know, the idea that Carver is only renting the space of a book, of a short story collection from Lish, because he was so dependent on Lish, and this massively influenced the minimalist form, you know, that for which he's become associated with. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and whether or not Berlin also had any kinds of there were kind of any sort of extra textual relationships that really affected Berlin's writing.
Amazing question. Thank you. Yeah, I think you could definitely think of it that way, especially in terms of like restricting Carver to sentence-based and kind of story-based spaces, in the same way that perhaps a landlord would restrict a tenant to a certain space and decide when a lease should break, you know, just as Lish had a lot of input in terms of when a story should end. Yeah, for sure. I also think it's interesting, so yes is my answer. And also, I also think it's interesting to think of short stories as renting space in literary magazines, because especially during that particular period, well, both Berlin and Carver, I didn't have time to address this, I thought of putting it in, but anyway, I can say it now, lived in Berkeley in the early 1970s. So even though Berlin was not very well known until kind of 2015, when this FSG collection unexpectedly made the New York Times bestseller list, it's possible that he did read her work, because they were kind of part of this Bay Area publishing community during that period. And they, you know, it was very much about publishing in literary magazines, renting a space in those literary magazines. So I don't know, that's just another strand of thought about tenancy in the short story. And also like this whole idea of being like juxtaposed perhaps in an anthology or in a literary magazine, the way that, you know, urban tenants are often like juxtaposed in a building. But yes, and then in response to what you asked about Berlin and editing, she's the complete opposite. So part of the reason why she only published short stories was that she got a book contract in the late 1950s. I found this out by like reading her correspondence, and so objected to Little Brown, to their editorial input, that she cancelled the contract and only wrote stories on the condition that no one edited them for the rest of her life. And, you know, to the point where with her fourth collection, she actually typeset it, and she would compose stories and like change them and edit them on the linotype machine. So she was the complete opposite. If that answers your question. Thank you.
I'm just waiting to see if anyone else has got a question. I mean, I've got a few myself, but if anybody else has got a question that they want to ask our panelists. Yes, okay. Yeah, Damien, you've got a question for Katrina. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much, Christopher. Yeah, my question's for Katrina, if possible. Thank you first to all the talkers for fantastic, really interesting talks. Katrina, I just wanted to ask, I was particularly struck when you were talking about the publication that you made, and when you talked about it as an intimate space, which I thought was really, really fascinating. It just made me think about a contrast that I felt going on throughout your whole project, really, between these ghost estates as presumably once intimate spaces, family homes or places to be lived in, and the contrast between them as ghost estates now. I just wanted to ask whether the idea of intimacy affected other areas of your work, or how it did.
Yeah, I think it's just, you know, it's really interesting, you know, when you think about the idea of intimacy, because I think just even my engagement with the room was quite interesting, like the ghost estate, you know, that was very connected to me because it was the estate where I live. But the actual room, the commercial room, which became one of the, you know, the main sort of site of the film and the Polaroids, like I started, you know, calling it my room, and it's just, you know, outside the city. But I sort of felt this direct, you know, I sort of took ownership of it because it, you know, of my visits to it, you know, they were very challenging going into, because it was humongous, you know, it was a massive space, but it sort of became very much my space, and I sort of, you know, in my head sort of took a sort of ownership. So, you know, my joke was always like, you know, it's my space. And I think it was quite interesting just with the Polaroid medium itself. It's quite an intimate medium. It's quite, you know, you want to hold it, you want to touch it. You know, I think, you know, there is a lot of nostalgia with Polaroid. And I thought that was quite interesting in reference to this very large, you know, ruin with these large towers and then this little photograph. So I felt like for myself, it was nice to do the book, you know, as something that people could take away, and it would be intimate to show the intimacy of the Polaroid. I hope that's answered it okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Great. Okay, we've also got a question here from Paul Gardner, which I hope you don't mind reading out. He says, It's directed to Katrina. He says, would you see the return to analog as a means of production and consumption as a reaction to our so-called digital life, the rise in vinyl record sales, a return to Polaroid as a need for the tangible in our lives? That's a brilliant, it's a really great question. I think that's something as well that Mark Fisher talks about a lot. Katrina, what are your thoughts on that? So the return to analog as kind of a reaction to digital life.
Yeah, I do. I think that's quite important. It's funny. I just had a review recently, and that was something, with my supervisors, we talked about, that working with analog has been like a reaction in a way to the digital, because I felt my initial research was recording with digital photography and video, but I felt it just couldn't get a sense of the room, and in some way the analog sort of mirrors the subject matter because of the rune being redundant and obsolete, and so are these mediums. So I felt like, you think of the imprint, like digital's a code, while the analog's physical, it's material, and and I think that's the beauty of it. So there is that sort of, that's why I think I chose it, because I felt the digital couldn't actually capture the atmosphere or the sensibility of the room, for me anyway.
That's great. Right. I think we've got time for a couple more questions, but I suppose my question would be, I'll direct one of my questions to Nina, because I found the stuff about tenant fiction there interesting, and thinking about Jay's paper as well, because Jay was talking about, I think, if I'm correct, about post-millennial capitalism being principally characterized, or since the 90s, about that global dynamic in the sense of a global crisis. But I'm thinking about particularly this idea of tenant fiction, and American tenant fiction. Is like, do you envision that as something that is very much like a national literature, like an American tenant fiction? Because I was thinking there was a brilliant edited collection of an edited collection called Common People, that was crowdfunded by Kit DeWall, and it's all like tons of different short stories and like narratives from different people, working class people and working class writers growing up in the UK. And so much of UK of that narrative is about the idea that you did have social housing, and they came from like a generation in the 60s and 70s and I'm thinking about working class writers today, where the private rented sector is so central. I mean, particularly when I was growing up, that whole idea of tenant flats and blocks or anything like that is quite I think different today compared to 30, 40 years ago. So do you see tenant fiction as maybe something that manifests in different ways, or does it have these principles you identified maybe differ in different national contexts, or how would that fit into this whole global system that Jay identified?
Great question, thank you. And thank you, Jay. Also, so many things that I'm kind of keen to research and bring into my research from your paper. Yeah, I absolutely think that tenant fiction is adaptable to different contexts. I actually think that's part of what makes it work. And I think the short story is an inherently very adaptable form. It's unstable. Really, the only thing that's consistent about it is that it's short. And that was something I was kind of keen to explore in my paper, and that I'm still thinking through. So let me know if you have any ideas. This idea of the association between like starting again and starting again and starting again as someone who's forced to move all the time, and also being kind of cramped into this small space. I hope you don't mind me responding with another American example, but from a different era, because that's what I know. But early 1950s, Gwendolyn Brooks published her novel, Maud Martha, which is kind of set in kitchenette social housing in Chicago in the 1940s. And even though it's supposedly a novel, I read it as tenant fiction. It's in vignettes, like these short kind of juxtaposed vignettes about this kind of character's life in this kind of housing situation. And I think that kind of draws on the same properties of like shortness and disruption and crisis and starting again and displacement that Carver's and Berlin's work does, but in a different context, and kind of places them in relation to each other in a different way. So like they're kind of strung together as this novel, even though there are still these fragments. So I don't know, that's one example of the adaptability of tenant fiction. But thank you. Yeah, I think something. I mean, it is adaptable. Like that's part of the point of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I can see something emerging out of that, and looking at kind of different national traditions or national transformations of that. And I don't know if in economics that whole idea of shorting or shorting stocks will fit in some way of talking about the shortness of the short story. I'm not sure, but yeah, no, thank you very much. And I can see that we've also got a question for Jay. And I suppose I'll make this the last question, and we'll wrap up for past. But Jay, I have a question from Paul Gardner, who's asking. So Winston Churchill once said that, quote, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those others that have been tried. In a similar fashion, would you argue that capitalism is the worst economic system, except for all the others? So I suppose this is more of a polemical take on characterizing, well, yeah, capitalism and the system of excess, and I suppose about envisioning alternatives, or perhaps is it just the lesser of many evils? Jay, sorry, I think your microphone.
Yes.
Yeah, there we go.
Just a second. Sorry. It's a big question. Well, let me see the question again. Well, I don't know, because I'm in the capitalist economy.
Yeah.
And of course, the form of capitalism and contents of capitalism are all different. I can see the difference between Korean capitalism, which is a little bit have the thick history of the past, the previous history of capitalism, and the UK capitalism, American capitalism. They're all different, but I'm confident that capitalism itself is the crisis, and it has to be overcome or overturned, and it has to be changed to go to another system, because the history just progresses. We can't go back to the previous economic systems that I haven't experienced. Well, the karatani that I referred to calls our attention to see some other exchange system and production system, which he's defined the mode of exchange A, mode of exchange B, mode of exchange C. And mode of exchange A is a gift system, and mode of exchange B is a kind of exchange between king and people, which is predominant in the Asian empire history. I'm not talking about Western imperialism, the Asian empire history, which was characterized, which is predominant in China and also in Korea. So mode of exchange B economy is kind of the exchange between domination and protection, like king protects people and people serve the king. And we are now in mode of exchange C, which is commodity economy. And in that system, exchange goes between commodity and money, and wages and labor power selling. And I hate that. So yes, I think always it's politically important that we fight against the moralization attempt of capitalism at all times to see the better future. I hope that answers.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's Paul saying the idea of the outsider viewing capital. I mean, yeah, that's a very important. I think that's a very interesting idea. Something I've noticed about Katrina's. I mean, both. I think both Jay's paper and Katrina's paper were to do with kind of interstitiality, or being in between something. Whereas, what I noticed a lot with Katrina is so much about participation and immersion within that. Whereas I felt with Jay, it was very much about dislocation. And it was the idea of you've got these two books that are noting you've got a spatial disorder, and then you've got, and so this question of, is it participation and immersion as a way? It feels like less so about maybe a message about political systems, but just putting people in a state in which they can be either made to feel like they're participating in something distinctly different, or dislocated from something that is so predicated upon dislocation. But yeah, I don't know, Jay, if you wanted to just quickly give a final comment on Paul's comment about the outsider view in Lanchester's. I don't know if that's in capital or Lanchester's capital. But
Lanchester's capital, I think.
There you go. Lanchester's Capital.
Yeah, with the observer, but that what was interesting about this novel to me was the novel maintains this conflict, because it's not like objective third eyes. They also have their own crisis, and that crisis caused by is partially caused by the capitalism as a world economy, and one of the character who has a Pakistani character, and after crisis, as he experiences his own crisis, he decided to get a job and live the life with get a girlfriend and get a job properly and go into the society, not being an outsider anymore. So that kind of gives me kind of like ominous future, which is pretty capitalist future that you can imagine out of his new determination. So that novel brings the other observers' sights, but at the same time, how the capital subsuming power is really powerful. So that conflicts and tensions in the novel is another interesting point, I think. Is it relevant?
No, that's brilliant. That's great. Right. Okay, we've run over ever so slightly by half an hour, but it's been very it's been very lovely to listen to all of your papers. Brilliant papers from Nina, Jay, and Katrina. Thank you very much for your time, for your presentations. Such great variety. And I think they spoke very productively to each other in terms of dissertation, interstitiality, property. So yeah, thank you very much for your time, and thanks very much for our questions as well. Applause for me. I suppose this dovetails nicely with saying that if you haven't signed up already, we've got a panel tomorrow. That'll be our third panel, marking the middle of the week, on beyond the human, or considering the ecological crisis from the perspectives of from prose, poetry, and film, looking at magic and enchantment from non-human perspectives, and then also very much building on what we've all been talking about today, which is the interconnectedness, kind of constant connectedness to others. What does that impose for questions of ecology? So very exciting for tomorrow. So I hope to see some, if not all of you there. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. See everybody.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.